The Imperial Stormtrooper. Iconic, elite, and known for having the best aim in Star Wars. Or not. But although we all know the Stormtrooper for their signature white armor, just how many different types of variants are there of them? Well, in this video, we're going to break down each and every Stormtrooper type, and let's just say some on this list are a lot more deadly than you might think. So let's get right into it. Standard Infantry. Starting out with our first category of troopers, we have Standard Infantry, which in other words were your more regular troopers. First off, we have the classic Imperial Stormtrooper. Imperial Stormtroopers were the Galactic Empire standard troopers and were known for their shiny white armor and their iconic E11 blaster weapons that they used. These troopers were the face of the Empire and were deployed across countless worlds all throughout the galaxy to enforce Imperial rule. They were trained purely for obedience and intimidation, and in a way you can see them as the backbone for the Empire's military. Within these troopers though, you'll notice that some wore different colored pauldrons. Orange pauldrons were for those who led small stormtrooper units during both patrols and combat operations. White pauldron troopers were sergeants who mainly coordinated battlefield tactics and relayed orders. So in other words, an experienced leader. Black pauldron troopers led troopers with extreme combat experience and were usually trusted with high-risk assignments. Then finally, red pauldron troopers were commanders who would oversee multiple squads and would execute major Imperial tasks. Next up, we have the Elite Squad Troopers. Elite Squad Troopers were the Empire's first non-clone special forces and were used as a test to see if they could replace clone troopers. These troopers were trained by the clone commander Crosshair and were recruited to carry out brutal missions for the Empire. However, unlike the traditional white armor, these troopers wore dark gray armor along with green visors. But regardless of their looks, these troopers didn't last that long. In time, there's a lot of conflict within the squad, leading to Crosshair wiping out all of them and marking the end of the Elite Squad Troopers. Next, we have TK Troopers. Now, after the Elite Squad Troopers, TK Troopers also became some of the earliest soldiers of the Empire. They were the transition between the Republic's clone troopers and the later Imperial Stormtroopers. So in a way, you can kind of consider them the middlemen. TK Troopers were known for wearing prototype armor and represented the Empire's shift from clone soldiers to human recruits. These troopers were really the start of human soldiers instead of clones, and were extremely prominent within the Empire's first few years of power. Next on our list, we have Patrol Troopers, which in other words were the Empire's police. These troopers were assigned to routine security and law enforcement duties across Imperial-controlled worlds. They focused on maintaining order, conducting inspections, and responding to minor threats. Now, you won't ever really see them on the front lines like the other soldiers we spoke about, but they did their part. Environmental and Terrain Specialists. Entering our next category of troopers, we enter the Environmental and Terrain Specialists. As for the first on our list, we have Sand Troopers, or sometimes known as Desert Stormtroopers. Sand Troopers were specialized stormtroopers equipped for harsh desert conditions. These troopers were each given cooling systems, survival gear, and were commonly seen on speeder bikes or even dewbacks for extended patrols and searches. A huge example of Sand Troopers were the ones we saw in A New Hope that were tracking down C-3PO and R2-D2. Next up, we have the Zero-G Assault Stormtroopers, or in simpler terms, Space Troopers. Now, unlike Sand Troopers, Space Troopers were trained and equipped for direct combat in the vacuum of space. However, for this to work, they had to have the best of the best armor. So, Space Troopers were given heavily modified Zero-G armor that provided them life support, thruster mobility, and enhanced protection. That way they could last out there. Now, although their armor was still mainly a white color, they were given many advantages that regular troopers didn't have. Next up, we have Snow Troopers that were first seen on Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back. Snow Troopers specialized in cold and icy environments, and their armor made sure of that. See, Snowtrooper armor was actually insulated with thermal layers and face coverings. That way, these troopers can survive the harsh cold conditions. These troopers were primarily deployed on frozen planets like Hoth, and can sometimes be seen using snow speeders for mobility and combat efficiency. Next up, we have one of my personal favorites, Shore Troopers. First seen in Rogue One, Shore Troopers were specialized for both tropical and coastal environments. Not only that, but because of the weather, these troopers had way lighter armor and gear that was suited for the heat and humidity. Shore Troopers were normally deployed for beach assaults, coastal defense, and really any operations on planets with shorelines or islands. Next, we have Wet Weather Gear Stormtroopers. Wet Weather Gear Troopers were specialized troopers for operations in heavy rain, swamps, and other wet environments. Because of this, their armor was waterproof and was designed to prevent any water damage. By having this allowed them to maintain mobility and combat effectiveness in any harsh, soggy conditions. Now, although we haven't really seen much of the Wet Weather Gear Troopers in different Star Wars projects, they played a prominent role in the Empire's success. Next up, we have Lava Troopers. Another personal favorite of mine, Lava Troopers were trained for extreme heat and volcanic environments. They wore heat-resistant armor, and similar to Sand Troopers, they had specialized cooling systems in their gear. In most cases, Lava Troopers were deployed for missions on molten planets or near lava flows, like Mustafar for example. At one point, Vader himself had Lava Troopers guarding his castle, which makes sense considering their specialties. Next, we have Magma Troopers. A bit similar to Lava Troopers, Magma Troopers also specialize in volcanic and molten locations. On top of that, they also had armor that was designed to withstand extreme heat and radiant energy. Because of this, they were usually assigned to carry out assaults near lava flows and enter dangerous environments that were too extreme for regular troopers. Next up, we have Sea Troopers. Sea Troopers were the complete opposite to the ones we just spoke about, as they specialize in underwater operations. As expected, these troopers had waterproof armor, as well as rebreathers and aquatic mobility gear. This armor was crucial for them, as it would allow them to fight and maneuver underwater whenever needed. Sea Troopers were primarily deployed into oceans, lakes, or other bodies of water for either infiltration missions or underwater combat if needed. Next, we have Forest Troopers. Not to be confused with Scout Troopers, which we'll be getting into later, Forest Troopers were specialized for operations in woodlands and jungle environments. As for their armor, they normally wore camouflage armor so they could blend in well for stealth operations and ambush enemies when needed. During the Empire's reign of power, a lot of Forest Troopers were stationed on Kashyyyk as part of its garrison. Sadly, we don't have any appearances from Forest Troopers in Star Wars, but they did play a key role in the Empire's success. Next up, we have Cave Troopers. Cave Troopers were troopers that were trained for underground subterranean operations. These troopers were given climbing gear, specialized lighting, and reinforced armor for confined spaces. Now, although they spent all their time underground, they handled crucial tasks like exploration, combat, and even tactical assaults down there, mostly in either caves or tunnels. Vehicle and Pilot Specialist. Entering our next category of troopers, we have Vehicle and Pilot Specialists. Starting out the gate, we have the AT-AT pilots. These pilots were troopers that were trained to operate the Empire's massive AT-ATs, or also known as all-terrain armored transports. These pilots specialize in navigating, targeting, and coordinating these walkers, making them key assets in invasions and ground assaults. As for their armor, they wore light gray flight suits along with white protective pieces, which was designed for their cockpit duties and walker coordination. Just like snowtroopers, we also saw AT-AT pilots in the Battle of Hoth and a ton of different times in Star Wars Rebels. Next up, we have AT-ACT pilots. Unlike the AT-AT pilots, these pilots were troopers that were trained to operate the larger AT-ACT vehicles, or also known as the all-terrain armored cargo transport. These vehicles were actually a variation of the AT-AT and were designed to haul supplies and heavy equipment. These pilots had to handle both piloting and tactical coordination, that way they could always make sure that cargo moved safely during any operation. As for their armor, they usually wore white armor with gray and red accents, and wore Imperial crests on them, making it unique to their role. Next, we have Tank Troopers. Tank Troopers were troopers that were trained to drive the Empire's armored vehicles. Tank Troopers specialized in heavy weapons, targeting, and battlefield mobility. Oh, and they also had some pretty cool looking armor too. Their armor was usually gray colored, and the commanders were even granted a black chest stripe to show higher authority. These troopers were seen in Rogue One, and just like the others on this list, played a huge key in the Empire's success. Next up, we have the iconic TIE Fighter pilots. TIE pilots were troopers that were trained to operate the various types of TIE starfighters and excelled in space combat and dogfights. However, their training wasn't easy. These pilots had to go through intense flight training and had to be absolutely perfect when it came to maneuvering, targeting, and coordination. Now, unlike the other pilots we've spoken about, TIE pilots were given all black armor and also helmets with life support systems. However, the most elite TIE pilots usually wore white, red, or even yellow helmet stripes, showcasing their high rank. Reconnaissance and Stealth. Entering our next category, we have our Reconnaissance and Stealth Stormtroopers. As for our first on this list, we finally have the Scout Troopers. Scout Troopers made their first appearance in Return of the Jedi and have been seen in a few later projects like The Mandalorian. However, these troopers were trained for reconnaissance, infiltration, and rapid response missions. They usually rode speeder bikes or other fast vehicles, that way they could always engage targets before heavier forces arrived. On top of that, their armor was also even made to be lighter, that way they could be quicker and have better mobility. In most cases, Scout Troopers were usually stationed at Imperial bases, cities, and planets, and always ensured law and order wherever they went. Next up, we have Stormtrooper Snipers. Stormtrooper Snipers were exactly what their name says. Imperial sharpshooters that were trained for long-range combat and were especially known for their sniper skills. These troopers were often drawn from the Scout Trooper ranks and were equipped with specialized sniper rifles, providing a huge advantage on the battlefield. Next, we have Range Troopers. First seen in the movie Solo, Range Troopers were troopers that were trained for long-distance engagements. Just like snowtroopers, these troopers also spent a lot of time in colder environments. Luckily though, their armor was designed for just that, and you can see just how heavy their armor was as they even had fur around them. In most cases, range troopers usually use sniper rifles and other reconnaissance equipment whenever in combat. They were extremely skilled at Overwatch, covering fire and targeting high-value enemies from afar. Next up, we have Shadow Troopers, and let's just say their name is exactly what they are. Shadow Troopers were elite stormtroopers that specialized in stealth. Unlike most on this list, these troopers wore black armor that were equipped with a portable cloaking device. From there, they were nearly invisible anywhere they went and were excellent in stealth attacks and striking enemies without warning. Sadly, we don't see any Shadow Troopers in any major projects, but they do appear in the video game Star Wars Battlefront. However, it's worth mentioning that Shadow Troopers did have their own variant of troopers, and these were called Storm Commandos. Storm Commandos, or also called Shadow Scout Troopers, were elite Imperial forces that trained for extreme combat. Exactly like the Shadow Troopers, they also had black armor and specialized weapons, but here's the big difference. Some of these troopers served under Vader's own 501st Legion and were known for being deployed into the deadliest of battles and covert operations. At times, even they would also help arrange traps to capture Force-sensitive users, such as any surviving Jedi. Heavy Weapons and Assault. On to our next category, we have troopers that specialize in heavy weapons and assault. As for the first on our list, we have none other than the Incinerator Stormtroopers. Incinerator Stormtroopers are kind of a fan favorite, as they were known for their flamethrowers and heat-resistant armor. Usually these troopers wore white armor and had red accents around it, but that's not all. Their main responsibilities were to clear bunkers, enemy strongholds, or anywhere where fire was needed. With their flamethrowers, they were able to cause intense damage pretty quickly and were a huge key to the Empire's intimidation. Next we have Flame Troopers. Now, Flame Troopers were a bit similar to the Incinerator Troopers, but here's the difference. For starters, they had several different designs of armor, and one even looked similar to the Snow Trooper design. Just like Incinerator Troopers, they were also used for clearing areas with their flamethrowers, but were usually used to defend Imperial facilities. If ever attacked, the Flame Troopers would usually be on the front lines, doing whatever they could to defend their empire. Next up, we have Artillery Stormtroopers. Artillery Troopers were stormtroopers that were trained to operate heavy siege and long-range weaponry, like cannons for example. They usually help provide fire support and coordinate large-scale attacks from a distance. Normally, they'd launch many different types of explosives at their enemies, and as for their armor, they look like normal stormtroopers just with yellow markings around them. Next we have Jump Troopers. Unlike the others so far, Jump Troopers were stormtroopers that were equipped holding rocket launchers and explosives. They usually were always on the front lines and played a huge part in providing firepower and wiping out any enemy targets. However, their most noticeable feature were their jetpacks. With their jetpacks, they were able to gain temporary flight and really get a height advantage over their enemies. Jump Troopers were extremely popular in the game Star Wars Battlefront 2 and can also be seen in Jedi Survivor. Next up, we have Rocket Stormtroopers. Kind of similar to the Jump Troopers, Rocket Troopers were Imperial specialists that always carried shoulder-fired missile launchers with them. These missiles could destroy vehicles, structures, and anybody within long range. Rocket Troopers were usually deployed to support any ground forces, and when used in battle, they had a heavy impact on the fight at hand. These troopers saw action in a few different battles, such as on Kashyyyk against the Jedi Cal Kestis, and even at the Battle of Jakku when the Empire finally collapsed. Next, we have Heavy Weapons Stormtroopers. Heavy Weapons Troopers were stormtroopers equipped with reinforced armor and high-powered weapons. These troopers were also usually on the front lines and specialized in breaking enemy lines and sustaining heavy fire during intense battles. Similar to regular stormtroopers, they also had plain white armor, but usually had a black shoulder pad, indicating their higher rank. Next up, we have Grenadier Stormtroopers. Grenadier Troopers were stormtroopers that specialized in using grenades and explosives to attack their enemies. They usually held many different explosives at once and were known to clear out enemy formations with them. These troopers were also known to wear white armor, but would also wear red pauldrons and black bandoliers to showcase their high role. Next, we have the Imperial Shock Troopers. Shock Troopers were elite stormtroopers that were trained for the more rapid, aggressive assaults. They were normally used to overwhelm any enemy defenses and usually had heavy armor and very advanced weaponry. These troopers were mainly former clones that served as a Coruscant guard back in the day, and as you can see, their red and white armor looks very similar. However, although their headquarters were on Coruscant, Shock Troopers were stationed at many different locations over the years, including Mandalore and even Naboo. Crowd and Civil Control. Entering our next category, we have troopers under Crowd and Civil Control, which only happens to be one variant of troopers. These troopers were called Riot Control Troopers. Riot Control Troopers were stormtroopers that were trained to manage civil disturbances and large-scale uprisings. However, unlike others on this list, they didn't always carry intense weapons. Usually they carried non-lethal gear like shields, batons, and tear gas. With that, their main duties were just to control crowds, and especially with how many rioted against the Empire, their roles were extremely crucial. Elite and Special Operations. Entering the Elite and Special Operations category of troopers, this is where things get taken up a notch. First, we have Death Troopers. Now, Death Troopers are nothing like your average stormtroopers. These troopers were elite troopers that were trained for special operations, covert missions, and protecting high-ranking officers, like Krennic for example. Death Troopers also wore advanced black armor and had enhanced communication, which is why you always hear them sound like this. Their communication was through voice scramblers, that way they appeared more intimidating and nobody else could understand what they were saying. It's safe to say that these troopers were some of the most lethal and terrifying troopers in the entire Galactic Empire. Next, we have Purge Troopers. Purge Troopers were mainly seen during the early days of the Empire and were trained to hunt down any surviving Jedi across the galaxy. They also had black armor, heavy weaponry, and usually worked closely with the Inquisitors to hunt down their targets efficiently. The very first Purge Troopers were actually the last generation of clone troopers, making them extremely elite. However, as time went on, they were phased out, and just like your regular stormtroopers, they were eventually replaced by human recruits. Next up, we have Scar Troopers. one of the deadliest and elite groups of troopers in this entire list. Scar Troopers are also known as Special Commando Advanced Recon Troopers, were elite troopers that each specialize in different areas. Within this rank, there were many different units, and one of the most popular was called Task Force 99. Not to be confused with the Bad Batch called Clone Force 99, Task Force 99 were Imperial focused, but also similar in a lot of ways. Just like the Bad Batch, Task Force 99 also had members that each had their own set of special skills. However, their most respected soldier was their sergeant who was named Creel, as he led them in many battles and was so highly respected he was even handpicked by Vader himself. This group and the rest of the Scar Troopers normally only carried orders from Vader or any high-ranking officer. Next we have the Imperial Super Commandos. Imperial Super Commandos weren't actually human recruits like most of this list, but instead they were Mandalorian warriors that were loyal to the Empire. This group were elite enforcers to the Viceroy named Gar Saxon, and instead of normal trooper armor, this group wore white Beskar armor, a style to represent stormtroopers but keeping their Mandalorian ways. On top of that, they each carried jetpacks and specialized blaster rifles, providing a huge edge over their enemies. Under Saxon's command, they carried out many ruthless missions and were truly known as some of the most elite troopers. Next up, we have the Dark Troopers. Dark Troopers were in a category of their own, as they were advanced heavily armed combat soldiers designed for maximum power. However, not all of them were droids. Although we saw Moff Gideon have his Dark Troopers as droids, before that they were actually human pilots in a suit. These troopers had some of the most powerful battle armor, as it even matched up against Mandalorian Beskar. However, as time went on and the troopers went through different phases, Moff Gideon learned that the main weakness behind the Dark Troopers was that a human was under the suit. So he built his troopers purely as droids, which is exactly what we saw in The Mandalorian. With that, however, that concludes our list of every single stormtrooper type in Star Wars. But I want to know from you, out of every trooper we've spoken about, which is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you always.